Michelle Rusi had worked for Anthony Fabino for 18 months, and somewhere between managing his impossible schedule and memorizing his coffee order, she'd learned how to disappear in plain sight. It came naturally to her. Michelle was the type of person who listened more than she spoke, who could diffuse a crisis with 3 emails and 0 fanfare, who'd grown up being told she needed to be more assertive or more outgoing or just more. She never wanted to be more. Being less meant being safe, and safe meant she could do what she did best without the exhausting performance everyone else seemed to require. Her father called it playing small. Her former roommate had said Michelle was allergic to attention. A guidance counselor in college once told her that some people are born to lead from behind, and there was dignity in that. Michelle chose to believe the counselor. She was brilliant at her job precisely because she didn't need acknowledgement. She kept Anthony Fabino's world spinning while staying completely off the radar. Until Anthony. Because Anthony Fabino wasn't the kind of man you could ignore, even if you tried. Mid-30s, built like someone who knew how to handle himself in situations that didn't involve boardrooms, with the kind of dark intensity that made powerful men reconsider their offers before he even opened his mouth. He called himself a business negotiator. That was the polite version. What Michelle actually saw were conference calls conducted in rapid-fire Italian, briefcases that required codes she wasn't allowed to know, and visitors who wore expensive suits over shoulder holsters. But he'd never been anything except decent to her. He greeted her every morning like she mattered. When she'd mentioned once that she loved old noir films, he'd sent her a restored Blu-ray set of Hitchcock classics with a note that said, "Since you already live in black and white at the office." When she'd stayed through a snowstorm last February to help him close a deal, he'd made sure a car took her home safely. Michelle had been in love with him for 17 months and 12 days. Not that anyone would ever know. Michelle didn't do vulnerability. She was the assistant who made miracles happen, kept secrets locked down, and never complicated things with feelings. She was disciplined, dependable, and completely untouchable. Which is why what happened that night made absolutely no sense. The day Michelle interviewed for the assistant position, she'd been 3 weeks away from eviction, and operating on the kind of desperation that makes bad decisions look brilliant. The job posting had been vague, almost suspiciously so. Executive assistant for private consulting firm, discretion required, competitive salary. She'd shown up to a corner office in Midtown with her resume printed on paper she couldn't afford and her best interview suit that was 2 years out of style. Anthony had been standing at the window, back to her, phone pressed to his ear, speaking Italian so fast it sounded like music. When he'd turned around, Michelle's first thought was that she'd walked into the wrong office. Men who looked like that didn't hire women who looked like her. But he'd gestured to the chair, finished his call, and asked her one question. "If I tell you something in this room that could destroy me, what would you do with it?" Michelle had looked him dead in the eye and said, "Forget I heard it the second I walk out that door." He'd hired her on the spot. The first 3 months had been a test she hadn't known she was taking. Anthony would leave documents on his desk, contracts with names redacted, financial statements that didn't match the company books, flight itineraries to cities that didn't appear on any map app. Michelle filed them, shredded them, and never asked a single question. She learned his patterns. Coffee at 7, black with 1 sugar. Meetings that officially didn't exist but required her to block his calendar anyway. Phone calls where he'd switch languages mid-sentence, his voice dropping to something cold and surgical. She learned which visitors got the conference room and which ones got escorted to the back office with the soundproofed walls. She learned that Anthony Fabino was either the most legitimate businessman in New York or the most dangerous, and it didn't matter which, because she was paid to keep his world organized, not judge it. Somewhere around month 6, she'd realized she wasn't afraid of him. She should have been. Everyone else was. But Anthony had never raised his voice at her, never made her feel small, never treated her like she was replaceable. And that's when the feeling started, quiet and unwanted, and absolutely impossible to stop. Manhattan had been paralyzed by the kind of blizzard that turned the city into a frozen ghost town. Michelle's apartment felt like a snow globe someone had shaken too hard, the wind howling against the windows, the streets below buried under drifts that swallowed parked cars whole. She'd been home for hours, resigned to a night of silence, when someone knocked, her neighbor from down the hall, shivering and apologetic, holding an elegant gift basket wrapped in cream-colored ribbon. "This came for you downstairs. The delivery guy said it was urgent. From your boss, right? Anthony Fabino?" Michelle's breath caught. Inside the basket was a bottle of wine she recognized, Brunello di Montalcino, the same vintage Anthony kept in his office, and a beautiful glass lamp shaped like ocean waves, glowing soft blue. The card was handwritten on his personal stationery. 18 months of excellence deserves more than a paycheck. Thank you. A.F. Something cracked open inside her chest. She knew she shouldn't open the wine. Michelle wasn't a drinker. Never had been. But standing there in her tiny kitchen, staring at proof that Anthony Fabino noticed her, really noticed her, she poured a glass. Then another. The wine tasted like warmth and possibility. She carried the lamp to her living room, plugged it in, and the apartment filled with the gentle sound of waves lapping against an invisible shore. It was perfect. She was perfect. This moment was perfect. She picked up her phone to check the work email one last time and saw his message, sent hours before. Kovac merger financials. Did you file them under corporate or offshore? She should have typed the folder name. Her fingers knew the answer. But the wine had dissolved the wall she'd built between what she felt and what she allowed herself to say. She didn't type a folder name. She typed the truth she'd been carrying for over a year. It's yours. Her thumb hit send before her brain could stop it. The message showed as read immediately. Michelle waited for the 3 dots, the incoming reply. Nothing. Then her phone lit up with an alert from the security app she monitored whenever Anthony traveled to dangerous meetings. His GPS signal was active. Moving. Fast. Cutting through streets that should have been impassable, heading in a direction that made her stomach drop. He was coming here. To her apartment. Through a blizzard that had shut down the entire city. And something about the way his location dot was moving, aggressive and unrelenting like a predator that had finally found its prey, told Michelle this wasn't a man coming to say thank you. This was something else entirely. The pounding started exactly 26 minutes after Michelle hit send. Not a knock. A pounding that rattled the hinges and sent her wine glass tumbling, red spreading across cream carpet like blood. Michelle's heart leapt, that stupid, hopeful racing that happens when you think someone you love is about to walk through your door and change everything. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. Anthony showing up unannounced, finally seeing her as more than the woman who organized his calendar. She smoothed her sweater, pushed hair behind her ears, and opened the door wearing a smile that shattered the second she saw his face. Anthony Fabino wasn't wet from snow. He was fury made flesh, radiating heat that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with violence barely leashed. His black coat hung open, snow melting on his shoulders, and beneath it, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and somehow more dangerous for it. His dark hair was wild, like he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes, those eyes that had been kind to her for 18 months, were dead, empty. The eyes of a man who'd already made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside and Michelle moved backward on instinct, her body recognizing a predator even as her mind struggled to reconcile this man with the one who'd sent her Hitchcock films and remembered her coffee order. The door slammed shut behind him, with a finality that turned her sanctuary into a cage. He kept coming, kept advancing, and Michelle's spine hit the cold hallway wall, with nowhere left to run. The ocean wave lamp in the living room cast blue shadows across his face, highlighting the hard line of his jaw, the muscle ticking there like a countdown to detonation. He braced one hand against the wall beside her head, and Michelle saw the tattoos for the first time, dark ink spiraling down his forearm, always hidden beneath those pristine white shirts. The imagery was violent, beautiful, dangerous. His other hand stayed at his side, fingers flexing like he was physically restraining himself from wrapping them around something. Around her throat, maybe. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, her body responded in ways that made no sense, heat pooling low in her stomach even as fear crawled up her spine. "You came," Michelle whispered, hating how breathless she sounded. This close she could smell his cologne, that expensive scent mixed with something sharper now. Adrenaline, rage, snow and night air and whatever darkness had driven him through an impossible blizzard to reach her door. Anthony leaned in, and for one insane heartbeat Michelle thought he was going to kiss her. Her lips parted, her eyes started to flutter closed. Then his voice cut through the moment, low and lethal. "Where is the money, Michelle?" Each word was carved from ice. "You said it's mine. Hand it over." The words didn't make sense. Michelle blinked, her brain struggling to process. "What money?" "Don't." His hand slammed against the wall beside her head, and Michelle flinched. Not from fear. He'd hurt her. Some instinct deeper than logic told her he wouldn't, but from the violence in the gesture. The barely contained fury that said his control was a fragile, breakable thing. "Don't play stupid. Not after everything I trusted you with." His jaw clenched, and something flashed across his face that might have been pain if it wasn't buried under rage. $3 million disappeared from the Kovac account. $3 million that only 5 people could access. 4 of them have been with me over a decade. The accusation landed like a physical blow. He thought she stole from him. Michelle felt the last 18 months crumble, that careful foundation of trust and quiet longing turning to ash. "I didn't take anything," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I would never." "Then explain. It's yours." Anthony's face was inches from hers now, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes, could count the shadows beneath them that spoke of sleepless nights. His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingered, then jerked away like touching her was a temptation he was fighting. "I asked about the Kovac file and you texted back, 'It's yours.' What else could that mean except you're ready to surrender what you stole?" Michelle's world tilted. She'd meant her heart. She'd been drunk on wine and stupid hope, finally brave enough to confess feelings she'd carried for 17 months. And he'd interpreted it as admission of theft. The cruelty of the misunderstanding would be funny if it wasn't destroying her. "I meant," the word stuck in her throat, because what could she say? That she loved him? That she'd spent over a year building fantasies where he might love her back? How pathetic would that sound now, cornered in her own hallway, accused of the one thing she'd never do? "I think you've been playing me from the start," Anthony said, his voice dropping to something intimate and vicious. Sweet, quiet Michelle who never asks questions. Perfect Michelle who keeps all my secrets. And the whole time you were selling them. No. Michelle found her spine against that wall, found something that wasn't fear anymore, just hurt devastatingly complete. "If that's what you believe, you never knew me at all." Anthony stared at her, and for a fractured moment something shifted in his expression. Doubt, maybe, or recognition, but then it hardened again. He reached into his coat, and Michelle's heart stopped. Some primitive instinct convinced he'd brought a weapon. What he pulled out was worse. A small recording device, red light blinking between them like an accusation. "I've been recording since I walked through your door," Anthony said quietly, and there was something in his voice now that cut deeper than anger. "Finality. When I turn you over to the authorities, there won't be any question of your guilt." He'd come prepared to destroy her. Systematically. Completely. The wire meant this wasn't rage. It was premeditation. The man she loved had planned her destruction before he ever knocked on her door. Michelle felt tears burn behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him that. Anthony leaned in close, his lips nearly brushing her ear, his body heat overwhelming in the small space. His breath was warm against her skin, and Michelle hated herself for the way her body responded, the way even now, even during this, she wanted him. "I know you have the stolen assets," he whispered, and his voice was dark silk wrapped around a blade. "Don't make me tear this apartment apart to find them." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, and Michelle saw it, the cold certainty, the absolute conviction. He wasn't here to love her. He was here to destroy her. And nothing she said, nothing she did, would stop him from taking her entire life apart piece by piece until he found what he believed she'd hidden. The wolf had finally come to her door, and she'd opened it with a smile. Michelle felt something inside her snap. Not breaking implied there was still structure left to salvage. This was disintegration, the complete collapse of 18 months of carefully constructed hope. The words came out before she could stop them, raw and desperate. "I don't have your money." Her voice cracked, and she hated it, hated the weakness, but she couldn't stop now. "I meant my heart. I meant me." The confession hung between them in the cold air, pathetic and exposed, and Michelle watched Anthony's face for any flicker of understanding, any sign that the man she'd fallen in love with was still somewhere behind those dead eyes. Anthony went completely still. It wasn't the stillness of calm, it was the stillness of a predator recalculating, processing new information that didn't fit the pattern he'd already decided was true. His gaze locked onto hers, searching, dissecting, looking for the lie he was convinced had to be there. Michelle forced herself not to look away, even though every instinct screamed to hide, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility that had protected her for so long. Let him see her. Let him see what his accusation had done. Something shifted in Anthony's expression, something that might have been realization or regret, but it was gone too fast to name. His jaw tightened, and Michelle watched his hand move to his chest, fingers working the buttons of his suit jacket with movements that were too controlled, too precise. The kind of precision that came from forcing yourself to stay calm when everything inside was screaming. He pulled the jacket open, and Michelle's breath stopped. Taped to his chest, stark against the white of his dress shirt, was a small black device, Wires ran from it, disappearing beneath the fabric, and a tiny red light blinked steadily like a heartbeat. A recording device. A wire. The kind she'd seen in crime shows. The kind that meant someone was building a case, collecting evidence, preparing for prosecution. He wasn't just recording from his pocket with the device he'd shown her. He was wearing one, against his skin. He'd put it on before he left his house, before he drove through the blizzard, before he pounded on her door. This wasn't impulse. This was methodology. Michelle felt her knees go weak. The implication was so much worse than anger, worse than accusations. He'd come here prepared. He'd armed himself, not with weapons but with something more devastating. The tools to destroy her life legally, permanently, completely. He'd been ready to get her confession on tape and hand her over to authorities before she even knew she was in danger. The man she loved had walked into her home already convinced she was a criminal, already planning her arrest. You wore a wire. Michelle's voice didn't sound like hers anymore. The shyness that had defined her for 24 years evaporated, burned away by devastation so complete it left only honesty behind. You came here thinking I stole from you, and you wore a wire to my home. I had to be sure. Anthony's voice was rough, and for the first time since he'd walked through her door, Michelle heard something other than fury. Conflict, maybe. The barest hint of uncertainty. $3 million, Michelle. $3 million that could bankrupt me if it's the start of something bigger. I couldn't afford to be wrong. So you decided I was guilty. Michelle pushed off the wall, and Anthony stepped back, surprised by the sudden movement. She moved past him into the living room, needing space, needing air, needing something other than the smell of his cologne, that even now made her body respond in ways that felt like betrayal. The ocean wave lamp cast blue shadows across the room, and outside the windows the blizzard raged, burying the city in white. Her apartment had felt like a sanctuary an hour ago. Now it felt like a crime scene. You couldn't afford to be wrong, so you assumed I was a thief. 18 months of working together, of me keeping every secret you ever told me, and you still thought I'd sell you out for money. The evidence pointed to you. Anthony followed her into the living room, but kept his distance, his hand hovering over the wire like he was considering turning it off, but couldn't quite bring himself to do it. You had access to everything. You knew my schedule, my accounts, my meeting times. Everything that's been stolen, you could have taken. But I didn't. Michelle turned to face him, and she felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry in front of the man who'd just tried to trap her into a confession. You want to know what it's yours meant? Fine, I'll tell you. I've been in love with you for 17 months. 17 months of watching you, wanting you, building this stupid fantasy where maybe someday you'd see me as more than the assistant who files your paperwork. Her voice broke, but she pushed through it. I opened that wine tonight because I thought you finally noticed me. I drank it because I thought maybe, just maybe, you felt something too. And I texted you my heart because I was drunk and brave and stupid enough to think you might want it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Anthony stared at her, and Michelle watched emotions flicker across his face too fast to track shock, confusion, something that might have been pain. His hand dropped from the wire, and for a moment he looked lost, like he'd walked into a room expecting one thing and found something completely different. You thought the gift basket was from me, he said slowly, and it wasn't a question. It was realization dawning, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Michelle laughed, and it came out bitter and broken. The card had your initials. It was your wine, the vintage you keep in your office. Why wouldn't I think it was from you? She gestured to the lamp still glowing on her side table, casting its peaceful blue light across a scene that was anything but peaceful. You've never given me anything before. I thought maybe tonight was different. Anthony's face went pale. Not the flush of anger, but the bloodless white of genuine fear. What gift basket? His voice was sharp now, urgent. The fury from before replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. Michelle, what are you talking about? The one you sent. But even as she said it, Michelle felt ice slide down her spine. The way he was looking at her, the sudden tension in his body, this wasn't confusion. This was alarm. The basket that came tonight with the wine and the lamp. Your neighbor brought it up, said it was from you. I didn't send you anything. Anthony's hand moved to his jacket, and Michelle realized he was reaching for his phone, his movements sharp and controlled again, but in a different way now. Not angry, focused. The way he moved when he was solving a problem, when something had gone wrong in a deal and he needed to fix it fast. Michelle, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I didn't send you a gift basket. I didn't send you wine. I didn't send you anything. The bottom dropped out of Michelle's world. If Anthony didn't send the basket, then who did? And why? The lamp's soft ocean sounds suddenly seemed louder, filling the apartment with white noise that made it hard to think. Michelle looked at the bottle of wine on her counter, half empty now, the label expensive and familiar. She looked at the beautiful glass lamp casting its soothing blue glow, and she realized with growing horror that she'd trusted something she should have verified. She'd consumed wine from an unknown source because the card said it was from someone she trusted. She'd plugged in an electronic device without questioning where it really came from. Then who sent it? Michelle whispered, but she could see from Anthony's expression that he was already running through possibilities, already calculating threats, already shifting from accusation mode into something far more dangerous. Protection mode. And that's when she heard a soft sound from the hallway outside her apartment. Footsteps. Someone was out there, and they were trying very hard to be quiet. Anthony's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around Michelle's wrist in a grip that was firm but not painful, urgent but not cruel. He pressed a finger to his lips, the universal signal for silence, and Michelle's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him move, not toward the door where the footsteps had come from, but toward her side table, toward the lamp that had seemed so beautiful 30 minutes ago and now felt like a serpent coiled in her living room. He bent down slowly, examining it without touching, and Michelle saw his expression shift from alarm to something darker. Recognition. He straightened and moved to the kitchen with movements that were too quiet, too controlled, the way predators move when they know they're being watched. Michelle followed, her bare feet silent on the hardwood, and watched as Anthony picked up the wine bottle she'd been drinking from. He held it to the light, turning it slowly, reading the label with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His jaw tightened, and when he looked at her, his eyes held a fury that had nothing to do with stolen money, and everything to do with the violation of something far more personal. He set the bottle down carefully, then picked up the card that had come with the basket. His handwriting, or something so close to his handwriting that Michelle, who'd filed his documents for 18 months, hadn't questioned it. Anthony studied it for a long moment, and Michelle could see the exact second he recognized what she was only beginning to understand. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had studied him closely enough to know his wine preferences, closely enough to forge his handwriting, closely enough to know exactly what would make Michelle trust a gift without verification. Anthony pulled his phone from his pocket and typed something quickly, his thumbs moving with precision. He held the screen up for Michelle to read. "Don't speak. Don't react. Just read." The text beneath said, "Someone is listening. The lamp. Stay calm." Michelle's blood turned to ice. The lamp was still glowing on her side table, still playing those soothing ocean sounds that suddenly didn't sound soothing at all. They sounded like white noise designed to cover other sounds, designed to mask the fact that someone had been recording every word they'd said since Anthony walked through her door. Every accusation, every confession, her telling him she loved him threatening to destroy her, all of it captured by someone who'd planned this carefully enough to deliver poison wrapped in kindness. Anthony moved back to the living room, and Michelle watched as he picked up a heavy glass paperweight from her bookshelf, the kind she'd bought at a museum gift shop years ago and never thought would be used as a weapon. He positioned himself over the lamp, and Michelle understood what he was about to do a second before he did it. She wanted to stop him. That lamp had been expensive, beautiful, a gift she'd thought proved she mattered to someone, but the look on his face told her everything she needed to know about what was really inside that glass shell. He brought the paperweight down hard. The lamp shattered, glass and plastic exploding across the table, and the ocean sounds cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched electronic whine that made Michelle's teeth ache. Anthony dropped to his knees, pushing aside the broken pieces with careful hands, and Michelle knelt beside him, watching as he pulled the lamp's guts free from the wreckage. It should have been just wires and a speaker and a simple light bulb. Instead, tangled in the mess of components, was something that looked wrong. Too sophisticated, too deliberate. A small black device no bigger than a quarter, with thin wires running through it and a tiny light that was still blinking red even though the lamp itself was destroyed. "What is that?" Michelle whispered before she could stop herself, and Anthony's hand clamped over her mouth, gentle but firm. He shook his head sharply, and Michelle understood. If that thing was still blinking, it was still working. It was still transmitting. Someone somewhere was listening to them right now, hearing the destruction of their carefully planted device, knowing that their surveillance had been discovered. Anthony pulled his hand away from her mouth and held up his phone again, typing frantically. Microphone. Still active. They heard everything. They know I'm here. Michelle felt the apartment close in around her, the walls pressing closer, the blizzard outside suddenly less of a natural phenomenon and more of a trap that had been sprung at exactly the right moment. Someone had sent her wine laced with timing, not poison wine meant to lower her inhibitions, to make her do something stupid like text her boss a confession of feelings she should have kept buried. Someone had sent her a lamp that was really a listening device, sophisticated enough to pick up conversations from anywhere in her small apartment. Someone had studied Anthony well enough to know his handwriting, his wine preferences, his schedule. Someone had known he'd come here tonight, known he'd be angry, known he'd accuse her. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. And whoever had orchestrated it had heard every word of the past 20 minutes, including Anthony telling her he'd come here to destroy her, including Michelle confessing she'd been in love with him for over a year, including both of them realizing they'd been played. Anthony grabbed her arm again, pulling her close, and pressed his lips against her ear. His breath was warm, his voice barely audible beneath the howl of wind outside. We need to find out who delivered this. Right now. Michelle's mind raced back to the moment her neighbor had knocked, apologetic and shivering, holding the basket like it was nothing more than a thoughtful gift from a grateful boss. But it hadn't been her regular neighbor. The woman who lived down the hall was in her 60s, retired, always friendly. The person who'd knocked tonight had been younger, male. Someone she'd seen around the building recently but couldn't quite place. Someone who'd moved in within the last month, who'd been friendly in that careful way that didn't demand attention but ensured you'd remember him as harmless. She looked at Anthony, terror tightening her chest. If the basket had been a trap, then the person who delivered it wasn't just a neighbor. And if that person knew Anthony was here now because the bug had told them they probably hadn't gone far, Anthony seemed to realize the same thing, his expression shifting from anger to a grim, calculated focus as he reached into his inner jacket pocket. Anthony pulled a small notepad from his inner jacket pocket, the kind he kept for meetings where phones weren't allowed, where everything had to be written and burned, and scrawled 3 words in sharp, angry handwriting. Who delivered this? He held it up to Michelle, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The broken lamp still blinked on the table between them, that tiny red light pulsing like a warning they'd discovered too late. Michelle's mind raced back to the knock on her door, the apologetic smile, the basket held out like an offering. She leaned close to Anthony, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, and whispered as quietly as she could manage. Greg, my neighbor across the hall. He moved in last month. Said he found it in the lobby and brought it up for me. Anthony's face drained of color so fast Michelle thought he might pass out. He grabbed the notepad again, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote, and what he showed her made her stomach twist into knots. There is no neighbor across the hall. That apartment has been vacant for over a year. I know because I checked when I hired you. Michelle felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Greg, with his friendly smile and helpful demeanor, who'd introduced himself 3 weeks ago while she was struggling with groceries. Greg, who always seemed to be coming or going at the same time she was, who'd held the elevator for her, who'd made small talk about the weather and the building's terrible heat. Greg, who she'd thought was just another lonely New Yorker trying to be neighborly in a city that didn't reward kindness. He wasn't a neighbor. He was a plant. Someone who deliberately positioned himself in the apartment directly across from hers, close enough to hear through the walls, close enough to intercept deliveries, close enough to study her patterns and routines without raising suspicion. Anthony was writing again, his movements sharp and urgent. Corporate spy. Positioned close to bypass security. Physical proximity equals greatest vulnerability. He's been listening to your work calls through the walls. Michelle's mind spun backward through the last 3 weeks, cataloging every conversation she'd had in this apartment. How many times had she been on the phone with Anthony, discussing contract details, reading off account numbers, scheduling meetings that were supposed to be confidential? How many times had she assumed these walls were thick enough, that her home was private enough, that she was safe enough? She'd been so careful with digital security, encrypted emails, secure passwords, never accessing work files on public Wi-Fi, and the whole time the threat had been 3 feet away on the other side of a wall that might as well have been paper. Anthony grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the bedroom, away from the broken lamp and its blinking red eye. Once they were behind the closed door, he pressed his mouth against her ear, his voice so quiet it was barely breath. He heard everything. He knows I found the bug. He knows we know about him. His hand moved to her waist, holding her steady, and Michelle could feel the tension in his body, coiled and ready. He's trapped here by the storm, same as us. He can't run, which means he has to silence us before we can report him. The implications crashed over Michelle like freezing water. Greg, or whoever he really was, had spent weeks building his cover, planting himself in her life, listening through walls and stealing information worth millions. And now that cover was burned, Anthony had smashed the lamp. They knew about the surveillance. They knew Greg wasn't who he claimed to be. And a man who'd gone to these lengths, who'd committed corporate espionage on this scale, wasn't going to just walk away and hope for the best. He was going to protect himself. Permanently. Anthony was already moving back toward the living room, his movements careful and controlled, and Michelle followed because being alone felt more dangerous than staying close to him. He'd taken off his suit jacket, and she could see the wire still taped to his chest, still recording, though now it seemed less like a betrayal and more like evidence they might need if they survived this. He moved to the front door with steps so quiet Michelle couldn't hear them over the howling wind outside, and pressed his eye to the peephole. The change in his expression was immediate. Every muscle in his body went rigid, his hand curling into a fist against the doorframe. He stepped back and gestured for Michelle to look, and she didn't want to, every instinct screaming at her to stay ignorant, to not confirm what his reaction had already told her. But she moved forward anyway, pressing her eye to the small glass circle, and her heart stopped. Greg was standing in the hallway, not walking past, not heading to the stairs, just standing there facing her door like he'd been there for a while. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 30, with the kind of unremarkable face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. Exactly the kind of face you'd want if you made a living being invisible. He wore dark clothes and a calm expression that was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. And in his right hand, held low and ready, was a gun with something attached to the barrel that Michelle had only seen in movies. A silencer. Anthony pulled her away from the door and grabbed his phone, typing fast. He knows we found the bug. He's waiting to see if we call police or try to run. We're 3 floors up. Windows are frozen shut. He's between us and the only exit. Michelle read the words and felt her world narrow to this apartment. This moment. This impossible situation. The man she loved, and yes, she still loved him even after everything that had happened tonight, was standing beside her, unarmed except for his phone and whatever violence he kept buried under those expensive suits. And outside her door, a professional killer was deciding whether they'd already called for help or if he still had time to clean up his mistake. The blizzard raged outside, burying the city, and Michelle realized with sick certainty that even if they screamed, even if they fought, even if they somehow got past Greg, there was nowhere to run. The storm had turned her building into a cage, and Greg held the only key. Anthony pulled Michelle into the bedroom and closed the door with a softness that felt more ominous than if he'd slammed it. The room was dark except for the ambient glow from the streetlights filtering through snow-covered windows, casting everything in shades of blue and gray. Michelle could hear his breathing, fast and shallow, the kind of breathing that came from a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. He moved to the window and tried the latch, but ice had sealed it shut, the glass frosted over so thick they couldn't even see the fire escape beyond. They were trapped, and from the way Anthony's hands curled into fists against the windowsill, he knew it. He turned to face her, and in the dim light Michelle saw something she'd never seen before: fear. Not the controlled wariness he wore like armor in business meetings, but genuine, visceral fear. He pulled out his phone and typed, his fingers shaking slightly. "I'm finished. This afternoon I discussed the Kovac account numbers in my office. Out loud. If Greg has been listening that long, he's already accessed the accounts. I'm bankrupt." Michelle watched him type, watched the resignation settle over his features, and felt something shift inside her. For 18 months she'd been the invisible assistant, the one who solved problems quietly and never asked for credit. For 18 months she'd watched Anthony navigate impossible situations with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Always 3 steps ahead, always in control. And now he was falling apart, spiraling into panic because he thought he'd lost everything. And Michelle realized she was the only one who could stop the fall. She moved to her work bag, the leather messenger she carried every day between the office and home, worn and unremarkable, and never worthy of a second glance. Her hands were steady as she reached inside, pushing past her laptop and tablet and phone, all the expensive technology that was supposed to make work easier and more secure. Instead, she pulled out something that looked like it belonged in a museum. A small notebook, maybe 5 by 7 inches, with a battered cover and pages that were yellowed at the edges. The kind of notebook you could buy at any drugstore for $3. Anthony stared at it like she'd pulled out a weapon. Michelle held it up, letting him see the worn cover, the way the binding was starting to come loose from being opened and closed hundreds of times. She leaned close, her lips almost touching his ear, and whispered so quietly the words were barely sound. "I don't trust computers. Never have. Every real number, every actual figure, I write it here first. The ones on the server, the ones Greg stole, those were all wrong, off by enough to be useless." She watched Anthony process this, watched his eyes move from the notebook to her face and back again, and saw the exact moment understanding hit. His expression shifted through disbelief to hope to something that looked almost like awe. Michelle had spent weeks establishing a system, painstakingly creating false data trails that looked legitimate enough to pass casual inspection, but were worthless if anyone actually tried to use them. Every bank code, every account number, every contract detail that mattered, she'd kept the real versions locked in paper and ink, immune to hacking and surveillance and digital theft. The cloud could be breached, servers could be compromised, but this $5 notebook that she kept in her bag, that she carried with her everywhere, that she'd filled with 18 months of meticulous handwriting, this couldn't be stolen remotely. This required physical access. And no one had ever thought to look for it because no one believed people still worked this way. "You saved everything," Anthony whispered, and his voice cracked on the last word. He reached for the notebook but stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them like he was afraid to touch it, afraid to believe it was real. "You saved me," Michelle nodded. And the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 18 months shifted so completely it felt physical. She wasn't the assistant anymore. She wasn't the shy girl who needed protection or guidance. She was the one holding his entire empire in her hands, and the weight of that realization settled over both of them like snow. Anthony looked at her, and Michelle saw guilt flash across his face, raw and sharp and devastating. He'd accused her. He'd worn a wire to her home. He'd been ready to destroy her for a theft she hadn't committed, and the whole time she'd been the only thing standing between him and ruin. "Michelle, He started to speak, but she pressed her fingers against his lips, silencing him. Not because she forgave him, not because the wire taped to his chest didn't still feel like a knife in her ribs, but because they didn't have time for apologies or explanations or the messy emotional reckoning that this moment deserved. They had a man with a gun outside her door, and survival had to come before forgiveness. Anthony's hand came up to cover hers, his fingers warm against her cold skin, and for a moment they just stood there in the darkness, connected by touch and necessity, and the complicated tangle of feelings neither of them had time to examine. Michelle felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the notebook pressed between them like proof of both her competence and his failure, felt the heat of his body and the scratch of the wire beneath his shirt and the impossible situation closing in around them. The sound came from the living room, soft, deliberate. The scrape of metal against metal that Michelle's brain needed 3 full seconds to identify. A lockpick. Someone was working the deadbolt on her front door, and they were good at it because the sound was steady and patient, the work of someone who'd done this before. Greg knew the lamp was destroyed. He knew they'd figured out who he was. And he was done waiting in the hallway hoping they'd make a mistake. He was coming in, and the only thing standing between him and the notebook that held millions of dollars in negotiation data was a bedroom door that wouldn't stop a determined kick, let alone a man with a gun and nothing left to lose. Anthony grabbed Michelle's hand and pulled her toward the window, moving with the kind of controlled urgency that spoke of a man used to operating under pressure. The lock-picking sounds from the living room continued, methodical and patient, each soft scrape a countdown to the moment Greg would push through her front door. They had maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. Anthony pressed Michelle back against the cold window, his body blocking hers from view of the bedroom door, and she felt the ice seeping through her sweater, numbing her spine even as his chest radiated heat against her front. He pulled out his phone, typing with one hand, while the other stayed pressed against the wall beside her head, caging her in a position that was becoming dangerously familiar. "We can't fight him. We need to make him think we're distracted. Emotional, not a threat." Michelle read the words and understood immediately what he wasn't typing they needed to perform, to create theater convincing enough that a trained operative would believe they were too caught up in personal drama to be planning an escape. Anthony's hand moved to her throat, not squeezing but resting there, his thumb against her pulse point. She knew he could feel her heart racing, could feel the way her body responded to his proximity despite everything that had happened tonight. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, and whispered instructions so quietly she had to hold her breath to hear them. "We fight." Loud enough for the broken lamp's microphone to pick up. "You scream at me, I'll scream back. Use real emotion. Make it believable. While we're shouting, we move toward the window. The fire escape. It's our only chance. Michelle nodded, and Anthony's thumb pressed slightly against her pulse, acknowledging her agreement. Then he stepped back, creating distance between them, and Michelle saw him slip into a different version of himself. The businessman who negotiated million-dollar deals with stone-faced criminals became a man caught in a relationship meltdown, his expression shifting to frustrated rage that almost looked real. He was good at this. Too good. And Michelle realized this was part of what made him dangerous in his world, the ability to become whatever the situation required. The deadbolt clicked. Someone had just breached her front door. Now, Anthony mouthed, and Michelle didn't have to fake the rage that bubbled up from somewhere deep and wounded. She'd been carrying hurt for the past hour, swallowing it down because survival mattered more than feelings. But now she had permission to let it out. She channeled every ounce of devastation from seeing that wire taped to his chest, from hearing him accuse her of theft, from realizing the man she loved had come to her home prepared to destroy her. "I can't believe you." Michelle's voice came out as a scream that surprised even her, raw and jagged and full of genuine pain. "You wore a wire to my apartment. You thought I was a criminal." She moved toward the window as she shouted, her hands fumbling with the latch, and Anthony followed, keeping his body between her and the bedroom door. "You texted me about stolen money," Anthony shouted back, and there was something in his voice that wasn't entirely performance, some real frustration bleeding through. What was I supposed to think? Everyone around me is bleeding me dry, and you're the only one with access to everything. I loved you. The words tore out of Michelle's throat, and she wasn't acting anymore. This was real. This was the truth she'd been too afraid to say until tonight. And now it was being used as distraction, as bait for a killer listening through a broken lamp. "For over a year I loved you, and you came here thinking I'd betray you for money." She got the window latch open and pulled, but nothing happened. The frame was frozen solid, ice sealing the edges where moisture had built up and crystallized in the sub-zero temperatures. Michelle pulled harder, her fingers burning from the cold metal, and felt panic claw up her throat. The fire escape was right there, 3 feet of frozen glass away, and it might as well have been on another planet. Anthony joined her, adding his strength to hers, both of them pulling on the window frame while continuing to shout at each other. "You're the only person I trusted," he yelled, and his voice cracked on the word trusted, genuine emotion breaking through the performance. "The only one who knew everything. And you send me a text about something being mine and expect me not to think the worst?" "It was my heart," Michelle screamed, slamming her palm against the frozen glass in frustration. "I was giving you my heart and you thought I was confessing to theft." She could hear footsteps now, soft and deliberate, moving through her living room. Greg was inside. He'd picked her lock in under 2 minutes, professional and efficient. And now he was searching the apartment for the notebook that held Anthony's entire fortune. The window wouldn't budge. Ice had welded it shut as effectively as if someone had bolted it closed. Michelle felt tears burning behind her eyes, not from the fake argument but from the very real terror of being trapped with a killer between them and the only exit. They'd planned an escape that wasn't possible. They'd created a distraction that was buying them seconds at most. And Greg was getting closer, his footsteps moving from the living room toward the hallway, toward the bedroom where they were trapped against a window that refused to open. Anthony grabbed Michelle's face in both hands, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with their performance. She saw something in his expression that looked like apology, or regret, or the recognition that they'd run out of options. He opened his mouth to whisper something, but the words never came. The bedroom door flew open, slamming against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. And there, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway with a gun raised and steady, stood Greg. His expression was calm, almost apologetic, the face of a man about to do something unfortunate but necessary. The face of a professional who'd just caught his targets with nowhere left to run. Time slowed to something thick and viscous, each second stretching as Michelle stared at Greg, standing in her bedroom doorway, with a gun that looked too big, too real, too final. His face was calm, almost regretful, the expression of someone about to complete an unpleasant task. He wasn't angry. That was somehow worse. This was just business to him. Elimination of witnesses. Cleanup. Michelle felt Anthony tense beside her, felt him calculating angles and distances, and she knew with sick certainty that he was about to do something stupid and heroic that would get them both killed. Then her eyes caught on the broken lamp in the living room, visible through the open bedroom door. The red light was still blinking, still transmitting. Greg had planted a listening device sophisticated enough to broadcast remotely, which meant someone somewhere had ears on this apartment right now. And if they had ears, Michelle could give them a show. She grabbed Anthony's phone from his hand, the movement so sudden it startled Greg into taking half a step back. His gun stayed trained on them, but his finger wasn't on the trigger yet. Still assessing, still deciding. Michelle's hands shook as she pulled up the browser, searching with fingers that barely cooperated, and found what she needed. A sound effects library. Police sirens. She hit play and turned the volume to maximum. The apartment filled with the wail of approaching police cars, tinny and artificial through the phone's speaker but loud enough to be convincing if you weren't looking at the source. Michelle watched Greg's expression shift from calm to confused to something that might have been fear. Anthony understood immediately, his mind catching up to hers with the kind of synchronicity that came from 18 months of working together. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the living room, toward the broken lamp and its blinking red eye, positioning themselves where the microphone would pick up every word. Officers. Anthony's voice was a roar that filled the small apartment, commanding and desperate and absolutely convincing. He's in here, armed suspect in the bedroom. Break the door down. He squeezed Michelle's hand, and she understood her cue. Please hurry, Michelle screamed, and the terror in her voice wasn't performance. He has a gun. He's going to kill us. She was sobbing now, genuine fear mixing with the act, her body shaking from adrenaline and cold and the impossible gamble they were taking. If Greg didn't buy it, if he looked out the window and saw no police lights in the street below, if he realized the sirens were coming from a phone and not from squad cars surrounding the building, they were dead. Greg's head whipped toward the living room windows, toward the front door, his professional calm cracking. Michelle saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, how long since the lamp was destroyed, how long it would take for someone monitoring the feed to call police, how fast NYPD could respond in a blizzard. The math was working in their favor. The timeline made sense. And Greg had been trained to abort missions when law enforcement was imminent, because a captured operative was a liability his employers couldn't afford. He's running, Anthony shouted, pointing toward the front door, even though Greg was still standing in the bedroom doorway. Officers, he's heading for the fire escape. It was pure psychological warfare, creating a narrative that Greg's panicked mind would latch onto. Give him an escape route. Make him think running was still possible. Greg's gun wavered. Michelle saw the moment he broke, saw training give way to self-preservation. He turned and sprinted for the front door, his footsteps heavy and desperate, no longer trying for stealth. They heard the door slam, heard his feet pounding down the hallway toward the stairwell, and then the building swallowed the sound, and there was only silence broken by fake police sirens still wailing from Anthony's phone. Michelle stopped the sound, and the quiet that followed was deafening. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and too fast, could hear the wind howling outside, could hear Anthony's exhale that sounded like relief and devastation mixed together. They'd survived. The immediate threat was gone, but as the adrenaline started to fade, leaving behind the shaking aftermath of terror, Michelle felt something else settle over her. Clarity. Cold and sharp and absolutely certain. Anthony moved toward her, his hand reaching out, and Michelle stepped back. The distance between them felt like a chasm that couldn't be crossed, with touch or apologies, or anything else he might offer. His hand dropped, and she watched his expression shift through relief, to confusion, to something that looked like dawning realization, like he understood what was about to happen, and was powerless to stop it. "We should call the real police," Anthony said quietly. "Report the break-in, the surveillance. Give them everything." But his voice sounded hollow, like he knew those words were inadequate for what had broken between them tonight. "You do that," Michelle said, and her voice came out steady in a way that surprised her. She moved to where she dropped the notebook during their fake argument, that battered $5 spiral that held millions in negotiation data, and picked it up. Her fingers closed around the worn cover, and she felt the weight of what it represented. Not just Anthony's fortune, her competence, her foresight, her value as something more than an invisible assistant who kept secrets and never asked questions. Anthony's eyes tracked her movement, and she saw him recognize the shift in her body language. Not the scared girl he'd cornered against a wall 2 hours ago. Not the assistant who'd spent 18 months making herself invisible. Someone else. Someone who'd just saved his life and his company and was done accepting scraps of acknowledgement in return. "Michelle, wait. We need to talk about..." "About what?" Michelle interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. "About the wire you wore to my home? About how you came here thinking I stole from you? About how I had to prove my innocence while you planned my arrest?" She moved to the closet and pulled out her coat, the heavy winter one she'd bought last year, the one that had seemed like an unnecessary expense at the time. She shrugged it on, and the familiar weight settled around her shoulders like armor. "I was wrong." Anthony's voice cracked on the words. "I know I was wrong. Michelle, please. Don't what?" She turned to face him, the notebook clutched against her chest, her hand on the doorknob of the front door that Greg had picked open 20 minutes ago. The door that no longer locked, that no longer kept threats outside where they belonged. "Don't leave. Don't walk away from the man who trusted a wire more than he trusted me." She saw something break across his face, saw him take a step toward her, and she opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying snow and the howl of the blizzard that was still burying the city. "I saved your company tonight, Anthony. I saved you. But I can't save us. Because there is no us. There never was." Anthony reached for her, his hand outstretched, his expression desperate in a way she'd never seen before. "Michelle, please, don't walk out that door. Let me explain. Let me fix this." But Michelle was already stepping into the hallway, into the cold, her feet carrying her toward the stairwell that would take her down and out and away from the apartment that no longer felt like sanctuary. Away from the man she'd loved for 18 months, who'd proven in one night that love without trust was just pretty words wrapped around nothing. The stairwell was colder than Michelle expected, the building's heating barely reaching the concrete shaft that connected 8 floors of apartments. Each step down echoed, and she could hear Anthony behind her, his footsteps faster than hers, closing the distance. She didn't run. Running would imply she was afraid of him catching her, and she wasn't afraid anymore. She was done. The difference was profound. "Michelle, stop." Anthony's voice bounced off the walls, desperate and raw. "Please, just stop for 1 minute." She kept walking, the notebook pressed against her chest, her coat pulled tight against the cold seeping through the stairwell's single window. Snow had drifted against the glass, obscuring the view of the street below, turning the outside world into an abstract blur of white. 2 more floors, then the lobby, then the door that would take her out into the blizzard and away from this building. This night, this man who'd proven that 18 months of loyalty meant nothing when measured against suspicion. Anthony caught up to her on the landing between the 2nd and 1st floors. His hand closed around her arm, gentle but insistent, and Michelle stopped not because he'd forced her, but because she owed them both this final conversation. She turned to face him, and what she saw in his expression would have broken her heart if there was anything left to break. Desperation, regret, the kind of pain that came from realizing you'd destroyed something irreplaceable. "I was wrong," Anthony said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I know I was wrong. I came to your home thinking the worst, and you saved me anyway. You saved everything." He was still holding her arm, his thumb moving in small circles against her coat sleeve, like he couldn't help touching her. "Let me make it right. A promotion, partner in the firm, your own office, name on the door. Whatever you want, Michelle. Just don't walk away." Michelle looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man she'd fallen in love with buried somewhere beneath the fear and the desperation. Saw the version of him that had sent her Hitchcock films and remembered her coffee order and made sure she got home safe during storms. But she also saw the man who'd taped a wire to his chest and walked through her door ready to destroy her, and she couldn't separate the two. They were the same person. The capacity for kindness and the capacity for betrayal existed in the same body, and she'd been naive to think otherwise. "You're offering me a promotion," Michelle said softly, and she pulled her arm from his grip. "A partnership. A nameplate. Things that matter in your world." She held up the notebook, that battered spiral that held his entire fortune, and saw him flinch. "But you still don't understand what you took from me tonight. Then tell me." Anthony reached for her again, and Michelle stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. "Tell me what I took, and I'll give it back. I'll do whatever it takes." "You can't give it back." Michelle's voice was steady now, no trace of the shyness that had defined her for so long. Something had burned away tonight, leaving behind someone harder, someone who understood that love without trust was just a beautiful lie. "You took the belief that you saw me, that I mattered beyond what I could do for you, that if something went wrong you'd at least ask me before deciding I was guilty." Sirens wailed in the distance, real ones this time, cutting through the howl of the blizzard. Michelle had sent a silent text to 911 20 minutes ago, while they were huddled in the bedroom planning their fake argument, and she'd known they needed backup whether their bluff worked or not. The police were coming to sweep the building, to take statements about Greg and the surveillance and the attempted... What? Assault? Murder? Michelle didn't even know what to call what had almost happened. All she knew was that law enforcement was about to flood this building, and she needed to be gone before they arrived. Before she had to stand next to Anthony and pretend they were a team, pretend that everything was fine, pretend that her world hadn't shattered along with that lamp. "I trusted a wire more than I trusted you," Anthony said, and hearing him say it out loud somehow made it worse. "I know that, and I know I can't take it back." "But Michelle," he stopped, and she saw him struggling to find words adequate for what he'd done. There weren't any. Some mistakes were too big for language. "You trusted a wire more than you trusted me," Michelle repeated, taking the words and making them hers. "After 18 months of me proving my loyalty every single day, you still thought I'd betray you for money." She held out the notebook, extending it toward him across the space between them. "So here, take it. It's yours. Just like I said in that text, everything you need to save your company is in here. All the real account numbers, all the actual negotiation figures, everything Greg tried to steal." Anthony looked at the notebook like it was a bomb, something dangerous that might explode if he touched it. "I don't want the notebook. I want you. You should have thought of that before you wore a wire to my apartment." Michelle pressed the notebook against his chest, forcing him to take it, and felt the finality of the gesture. She was handing him his empire back, and in return, she was taking herself back. The version of herself that had been willing to accept scraps of attention, willing to be invisible, willing to love someone who couldn't trust her. That version of Michelle was gone. "I can't work for you anymore, Anthony. I can't look at you every day and not remember that wire. I can't be in a room with you and not wonder when you'll decide I'm guilty of something else." The sirens were getting closer, maybe 2 blocks away, their wails cutting through the snow-muffled city. Michelle moved past Anthony, her shoulder brushing his, and continued down the last flight of stairs. She could feel him watching her, could feel the weight of his stare between her shoulder blades, but he didn't follow. Maybe he understood that some distances couldn't be closed. Maybe he was finally learning that there were consequences for breaking trust, and all the money and power and desperate apologies in the world couldn't erase them. The lobby was empty, the night security guard probably dealing with the police outside. Michelle pushed through the front doors and stepped into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical force. Snow driving sideways, burying the parked cars and turning the street into a white tunnel. Visibility was maybe 20 feet. The city had shut down, but she could see a taxi crawling up the street, its off-duty light on, the driver probably heading home. Michelle stepped into the road and raised her hand, and miracle of miracles, the taxi stopped. She climbed into the back seat, gave an address 3 neighborhoods away where a friend lived who'd let her crash without questions, and didn't look back at the building. Didn't check to see if Anthony had followed her down, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing she cared enough to check. The taxi pulled away slowly, tires crunching through snow, and Michelle watched her building disappear into the white. Anthony stood on the sidewalk outside her building with snow accumulating on his expensive coat, the notebook clutched in hands that were going numb from cold. Police cars were pulling up, their lights painting the snow blue and red, and officers were climbing out asking questions about an armed intruder and a surveillance device. But Anthony barely heard them. He was watching the taillights of a taxi disappear into the storm, carrying away the only person who'd ever been loyal to him, the only person who'd ever saved him, the only person who'd mattered. He'd come to her apartment tonight prepared to destroy her, and instead she'd saved his empire, and he'd lost her anyway. The notebook in his hands held millions, but standing there alone in the freezing night, Anthony realized he'd trade every dollar, every account, every deal he'd ever closed to go back 3 hours and make a different choice, to trust her, to believe in her, to not bring that wire. But time didn't work that way, and Michelle was gone, disappeared into a blizzard that felt appropriate for the wreckage he'd made of something that could have been everything. He had his money, he had his company, he had nothing that mattered. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal and consequences, hit the like button. Do you think Michelle should have forgiven Anthony? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more dark romance stories where the ending isn't always a fairy tale.